a special guest on, Doug Turnbull, who's here with me right now.
Hello.
Yeah,
Hello, everybody.
Doug was my partner in crime with this book. I've gotten fairly coordinated at this now. Not perfect though. Um,
Oh, yeah. You mentioned something about on LinkedIn that is interesting, I think, is when you are doing AI development for a while, you might hit a point of what I call fragility, where changing one thing tends to create problems in another area. And I think you put a post on LinkedIn about technical debt. I think that's interesting because I think that's ultimately where the AI engineering starts to have a role when you kind of start with this ball of vibe coded stuff, and then you realize, oh, I've got to tame this ball of mud somehow. So I've had that experience recently with an editor I've been working on. It sounds
yeah,
like you had that experience recently with your Rook agent tool.
no. Uh,
No. Okay.
but yeah, I feel like I've got a good approach for not accidentally running into that. Okay, so I'm a Pythonista. That's my love language.
Yeah, sure.
But I just noticed that I can do TypeScript just as well as Python at this point. I spent 2 days getting my eyeballs where they could read TypeScript. And I got so comfortable not reading it after a while that's working on this Rook thing. One of the guys built a front end in Swift, and I know nothing about Swift,
Mm,
going pretty smooth. And so my policy now, even though I'm not reading much code anymore, is I have to have a good understanding of the cut points in the code. How does the code
yeah,
sync
that's a
through the
good idea.
layers? What's the API at each layer? And if I can keep that in my mind, or what are the data models, data structures? If I could keep those things in my mind, then that doesn't matter which language it is. But that's not a perfected art. The front end here, I've lost track of it, admittedly. So I'll be redoing that soon.
Yeah, I go through cycles. So I go through, and I am a code reader and a code writer, in part to help me internalize mental models of things. I think to some extent, what I'm finding is to some extent that's as much a personal preference as it is necessarily always the right thing to do. But I find AI coding very similar to 10 to 15 years ago when I would just be a random software engineer joining a project and there was this ball of code that had been worked on for 10 years and there were massive parts of it no one really knew how it worked. They appreciated the API and how the API worked, and that was stable and mature because there were actual users of this product. And
Mhm.
so the challenge became like, basically, how do you set up a system where you can make earth-shattering changes to the code base, but still feel safe that things are working? And there's an entire book about this called something Working with Legacy Code. And what I always say about AI coding is very similar to that. You are acting as the engineer trying to wrangle what has instantly become a legacy code base because you don't understand it that deeply. And so one of the classic patterns in that book and in the universe of working in legacy code is this idea of a strangler pattern,
Mhm.
where you wrap the project at some basically quote unquote public interface that's not going to change much, often a published interface, so like an API, and you test the crap out of it at that level. And to me, that is like what I'll end up doing is I'll work for a while on a project. I won't understand those boundaries. Eventually, I'll hit some fragility where some bugs start happening. I fix this and something else breaks. And then I do need to establish some of like what that boundary is. And then that's where I care about is can I test at that boundary? How do I verify the tests work? How good are the tests? How comprehensive they are? And personally, once I gain a level of trust, then I'll stamp them out. I'll just be like, agent, let's stamp out tests in this bit of functionality now that you have, I guess you could say, developed a skill, or at least I've documented really carefully how I want tests to work in a way that I trust them. Yeah, and then I will just let it go to town with how it wants to test, ask it to propose tasks, ask it to analyze what functionality areas it thinks we're missing, and then I'll trust it to be automating a lot of the test generation.
Do you hold the test out so that after the AI has generated the test, it refactors without seeing the test and potentially breaking, deleting, and changing the test?
I haven't quite figured out a pattern to do that. I think that's actually important. In fact, I teach in my agentic search class. So for people who don't know, I'm Doug. I do search things. So a lot of what I do is work in retrieval. I work on RAG, and John and I have done some of those projects together. And one thing I've been interested in and something I have done a bunch of talks on is doing auto research on search rankers. So how do you produce a ranker that actually returns the right result? One way is to just let an agent figure it out, and another way is let an agent generate the code that will rank results, search results in the right order, and return relevant results towards the top using basic tools. In those cases, I think it's important to think really carefully about that, is to have a holdout. I also think it's really important to find a way, if I was to go super autonomous, to hold out the tests and not let the agent see them. But I haven't found a pattern that works really well that I'm satisfied with. I think there are patterns people use because agents cheat a lot and they'll go and use their, if you say you can't read this directory, they'll figure out a way to use bash to read that directory. And the other methods are like keeping the tests in some completely different code base or repo. So you have some like validation repo that's separate from the actual coding repo. And that doesn't feel satisfactory to me either. I don't want to manage across different Git repositories and stuff, but maybe that's what you have to do. I don't know. Do you have a way that works that you do for that?
When I wrote that LinkedIn post, it was the first time that I'd really thought about it as a thing. My thinking that day was like, we know everyone makes fun of the technical debt caused by AI. It's getting worse,
Yeah, totally.
models are, but they're getting better. But it occurred to me that the models themselves are choking through a 20,000 line long file that you created a long time ago, or that the dumber agent created last year. And it's having to reread and jump around and get confused. And if you had something that could dependably collect tech debt periodically, then not only would it just lead to a better code base that you could plausibly understand, but it would also lead to something that an agent could navigate more easily. And then you could save a lot, I would think, on tokens and stuff. So as like a startup idea is where it's coming in. And if you can say, run my agent, and historically we have saved people 50% on their token spend, like that ROI story is, it's a great startup idea. But that means that there's 40 people trying it right now. So
Yeah, probably. There is research on this. There's something called Deep Slop Code Bench or something that looks at repeated agent coding, like basically repeated loops and accumulated slops and a slop and how agent performance degrades. There is research showing that you will spend more money as agents figure things out, and usually it causes degraded performance. It's always hard to keep up with these things because maybe, I don't know, maybe Fable is fine and it can just navigate it. So I'm working on this editor, and it's just a markdown editor that kind of gives me feedback.
by the way, do you want to show that thing off when it makes
Yeah,
sense?
it's not super exciting, but I will show it. I more or less just got tired of dealing with the going from Notion to GitHub because that's my path for blogging. So going from Notion, like I write a lot in Notion. Notion has good spell checking and grammar checking, and it's generally a pleasant environment.
Hmm.
Invariably, what happens, so this is a classic I'm vibe coding some tool that the user is me, n equals one. Invariably, what happens is I paste a blog post with my front matter into my blog because I have a Jekyll blog. A lot of people have blogs with like Hugo and stuff where basically their blog posts look like this. I go to publish the blog and I invariably am not happy with something when I see it rendered in my drafts folder of my blog. And the GitHub editor is not super great in terms of grammar and spelling checking.
Yeah.
So out of a level of additional social consciousness, I'll start editing more substantively in the GitHub editor. And invariably, I will start making lots and lots of additional grammar and spelling mistakes. So I just got tired of going between my Notion and my GitHub Jekyll site and kept making mistakes. And it was just very error prone. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to create an editor that lets me edit directly and has some grammar and spelling checking. I'll create new things here. They'll just live like my blog will become like my wiki, and I'll just try to write things there.
Mm.
And so that's what I did. And you can see here, it's trying to be dead simple and minimalist. There's a bunch of grammar and spelling suggestions on the right. I can also hover over and whatnot. So I've got a bunch of spelling and grammar stuff on the right. You can see I can navigate my like all my files and things. I can jump around. You can do normal stuff. In some ways, it's similar to Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is also super noisy and annoying with grammar and spelling mistakes for anything. So yeah, I've been hacking away at this. And it was something that interestingly more or less was done in a day. And in the meantime, I've just been trying to improve my ability to produce software around it, just to learn and educate myself more about agents and coding and whatnot. What was interesting to our earlier conversation was not so much about, I know I can go to an agent and I can say, dry up this code, refactor it, blah, 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 especially if I have really solid tests. And
Mhm.
there's going to be areas of code that are like extremely well covered with tests and automation that you could just let an agent go to town on. And there are going to be areas much less friendly to that, or you may need to do a little bit of your own investigatory work to make sure that the quote unquote software factory is set up correctly. What I found though is that technical debt was an accumulation of my own decisions that were incongruous. A lot of technical debt doesn't necessarily have to do with an accumulation of agent slop. One day, the agentic intern wakes up and decides to write code one way, and the next day it decides to do code in a different way. It's also because one morning I hadn't drinking any coffee, and instead of using the backend database that this uses to store some state of what the last open file was, I mentioned something about browser local storage. So this is an Electron app, so it's all really a browser. And it decided to do that. And so I had this, if you actually looked at the code, I had this dual path of browser local storage plus going to a backend database. And it lived that way for a couple of days. And eventually it caught up to me because I was having this weird functionality issue with state saving or not saving. And what was interesting was like when I would ask an agent to work on the problem, I have found that agents don't necessarily, when they're working on a problem, they take the safest path possible. It's like they will wrap away like a scab, this old way of doing things and preserve it as safely as possible so that this new path will work and they will solve the problem. But I think a human developer would follow what we would call the Boy Scout rule and say, oh, there is this other code path that's not really valuable anymore. And I could turn these 1,000 lines into like a couple hundred lines. And so those kinds of things are where I start to struggle with my instinct. One tool I think that's useful is to actually go and write code in those situations to just delete things, see what breaks, and in part to help me better inform the agent about the path to take.
I've definitely noticed that same type of behavior. One of the things when I was playing with Rook early on, I changed the agents in Rook speak to the front end in agent client protocol. And initially, I had written my own protocol, being unaware of ACP at that time. And
Yeah, yeah,
obviously, it changes. Like, all right, let's move to ACP. Let's connect these things here. Let's set up a few more backend agent runtimes to prove it out. And it happily did it. And then, like, I noticed in the conversation that it was also preserving, just in case we needed it, the ability to go back to this other entire parallel protocol,
exactly.
like freaking rip the whole thing out if there was a parallel protocol and all the if statements around that, and it made the code base a lot better. But yeah,
Right.
agents tend to do that. There's a few quirks that I'm starting to become comfortable with navigating, but it's a little bit annoying.
And it makes sense. Would you want an agent to make that kind of decision? There may actually be a good reason for that to exist. And it makes a lot of sense for an agent to, in a single prompt, make the most defensive choice. Those are also things where there is such a close relationship to the product, whatever the product decision is, down to the nitty-gritty code stuff. For whatever reason, a couple days ago, at the same time, a bunch of people tweeted, I still read the code. And those are this one of the situations I tended to find myself reading the code and being like, it seems like we could do this a lot simpler and then think critically about like how it should be structured and stuff.
Yeah, I love reading the code too, although in human language or code language, I've always been a slow reader, which is frustrating to me. So probably that combined with whenever I started programming in Swift, when I started programming in TypeScript, it's like, okay, I can read TypeScript if I squint my eyes really hard. Language, I love it. But when I started writing in Swift, when someone else wrote a big chunk of this code in script in Swift, and
Interesting.
I was like, I'm gonna roll with it and see how far it goes before it bites me. And it has been nibbling at me. Like
Yeah.
I've still got it on my screen right now. The UI, it's got some bugs that are just unexplained at this point, and it's frustrating that I have no explanation for them. There's like some memory issues. I had in big O notation in squared issue where if agent thought went on too long, that it would just get slower and
Yeah.
slower to append the tokens to it. So
Yeah.
it's not that I'm catching everything, even though I'm not reading the code, but still moving pretty fast, and I think I can overcome it more quickly with such an unfamiliar code programming language. I think I can move faster still.
So I see AI coding as there's two competing quote unquote contexts. There's the human context of keeping up with how the system works. And there is this notion that I'm sure you're familiar with called cognitive debt, which is the idea of the system drifting from my understanding of it, and then it becomes harder to reason about how to make a change. And then there is the actual context of the agent itself. So I feel like the ideal situation somehow maximizes both of those, your ability to be engaged in the process as a human and the agent's ability to accurately work. And sometimes the things on the human side are as much psychological and about the specific human being as they are about objectively, it's a good idea to read code or write code or whatever. My reading comprehension of code is higher than my reading comprehension of English. And so I just deal with that. And I feel like it's maybe, and you could argue maybe it's 10% better. It's technically a more precise representation of what's happening.
Yeah.
When I work with agents a lot, I'll do something, I'll get distracted, I'll look at social media, I'll forget what I was doing, and I'm coming back to the agent to see what it did and trying to remember what it was doing. But if I just go and hack on a bit of the code, at least to get some inspiration for how things work, and then maybe the agent rewrites everything. For my attentional system, I stay in more of a flow state than being always 100% in an agent guided workflow. So it's interesting. The more I talk to people, I think it's people are get status anxiety from wherever they sit on the how they manage their own attention. But I think there's just cognitive diversity in how people might manage their own attention.
Or how their own attention might manage them in my case.
Yes, that too.
Well, thank you, attention. Hey, we've covered a couple things so far. The one topic that we've been going over more is technical debt, but I don't know how to get started on a programming thing on that.
Yes, the very first thing I do when I'm doing this stuff is I would probably start describing the simplest bit of functionality I would want in bit easier in Markdown than I would probably start by like actually writing a spec of what you want. And to me, I tend to do that early in a project. I tend to move away from it later in a project myself. But I would probably be like, okay, what's a funny Electron editor? Let's maybe we make an editor that, there you go, all done, ship it.
Yeah, I've- we got to read the code too, right? I'm using Exit these days.
So, from a technical debt perspective, the first question I would ask is the first, does agent have, to the extent that there are any tests right now, how would the agent have visibility if it made a change to whether the tests passed or failed? And to me, because I'm always committing from an agent prompt, I pre-commit hooks are probably one of the most valuable tools to keeping things sane. So the other thing I just started doing was instead of having extensive documentation, I just am like, I'm a big believer, or at least as of a couple of days ago, it seems to work really well just to have a fat Agents.md file of all the things that are important. And I give like an overview of the architecture, how these things work. And my goal is ultimately like one thing I used to do is I used to have a long running conversation with an agent for building something. And I would
Mhm.
just like always resume that session and inevitably compaction would happen and it would lose half its brain. And but it was glorious during that while the context window was not exhausted. Now my goal is actually the opposite. Can I basically launch a new session in my agent and tell it something I want to change, and will it meaningfully do that work? And if I feel like I have that set up, I feel like the quote unquote factory is working well because it's simulating the like someone sends a Slack message to the agent and asks for a change.
Yeah. Earlier, you're depending on the collateral knowledge from whatever conversations you've been having, and
Exactly.
that you don't have to depend on it, then that's a healthier state.
Yeah, and that comes in two forms. And actually, our friend Hamel Hussein had a post about this. There's like the upfront stuff that helps the agent make better decisions, like the agent's MD, any skills you have, like basically different kinds of prompt and context engineering.
Mhm.
But you really need belts and suspenders. So the other side of that is all of the hooks and validation, pre-commit people like pre-commit hooks, hook in the get sense that defensively make sure the agent didn't do something stupid.
Yeah.
And if you have that set up, that's the holy grail. And typically, how I tend to think about it is there is a part of the factory line that you're running that's working really well, where you can take a prompt and I know I can make minor feature changes, bug fixes, whatever to that area, and it's going to be fine. But then where I think interesting is when you need to flesh out a new area of the system because it switches back to that exploratory mode. And to me, there's kind of a quadrant where it's like early in exploratory mode, I'm happy to be in like basically vibe coding land. But in the advanced stage of mature application exploratory mode, that's where I'm like probably still closer to whatever the original software. It's about to transfer money to your bank account, probably. I think that that quadrant of exploring, but in a mature application, is to me probably the most interesting quadrant because that's probably where it's like, oh, do I need to read code? Do I need to write code? Do I need to? Because you're probably balancing a dozen constraints of not breaking something that already exists, a long-term vision, in addition to just to the correctness of this one particular feature. So I still think that's where like our programmer software engineer brains are useful and are not obsolete. But it's exciting that in the like boring, I need to fix a bug in this existing functionality area, or I need to maybe try a new minor feature. That's really exciting to me that like you can set up your factory to be able to do that.
Yeah. One of the places that I've been wondering about is the way teams work. So I worked at GitHub and I left in early to mid 2024.
Yeah.
And that's before AI had completely eaten the world. And inside GitHub, even though we're making Copilot, we used completions. You could type stuff
Yeah.
complete, right? And at this point, 2 years ahead, the way that software is developed is completely on its head. And one thing that for myself, I feel like I've gotten pretty competent in vibe coding and spec-driven development responsibly. But all that stuff, I've become pretty competent in it for my projects I'm working on by myself. The thing that Rook is pushing me for is I'm working with three other people right now, off and on. And so what do we do? One person, Greg Cesarelli, he's a founder at Spec Story, is just advocates keep talking to humans, but push to main. That upsets my sensibilities as a 2024 developer on a team. But he's a cyborg, so I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't complain. So we're trying it. For my things, I still like having stuff at least chunked together as a PR, and then I can
Interesting.
aim it at an issue and say this PR addresses this issue. It is documenting at some level, but merge the PR to main. And then if it's something that's contentious, I don't know if the guys will like this or not, I just want to show it off, then that definitely goes in a PR and stays in its own branch for a while. That's where mentally I feel comfortable at, I think. But I'm curious what companies are doing right now. Everyone's doing something,
Yeah.
and it's not what it was 2 years ago. And most people are doing it
Yeah,
wrong.
I'd be really curious. I do closer to what Greg does when I'm solo developing.
Yeah,
I push to main all the time.
yeah.
I don't know what I would do if I was on a big team. And it's an open question. And for what changes also? For the areas where the agent factory works well, do you just shove it to main? And are there areas where you're doing more exploratory work? Would you want to have more of a discussion about it in a pull request?
I'm very comfortable with the idea of pull request. And Greg, despite being a cyborg, was never an engineer. He's very competent. He's a cyborg. He's amazing at creating code. But I have stuff built into me now from years of software development on teams that
I know.
I don't know how to morph that
Yeah,
thing.
totally.
Maybe this is good in the AI era because this is obviously real. I've freaking got a Zoom open. It's raw. Or maybe it's so unpolished that people think it's stupid. But
Yeah, I think it's really cool. People don't compare notes like this enough, and instead people argue about things on Twitter and
there's yeah, no way to demonstrate if
right, and the arguments are not multi-dimensional. They're very like, I don't know. They're Twitter arguments. That's all you can say.
figure out let's do this again sometime and hack on something a little bit meatier.
Yeah,
Uh
sure. We'll think of something.
Try Rook. I want you to start working on Rook. I want it to eat your soul like mine. Yeah, and figure out how to get other people on my show. Who would be
Okay.
fun? Who's a fun person to hack with? Be thinking about that for me.
Yeah, probably Hugo.
Yeah, I'll get him soon, I'm sure.
Cool.
Cool.
All right. Good to see you, John.
Good to see you, Doug. Have a great day.
Yep. See ya.